They'll say that narcissists don't form long-term relationships. No, the narcissist actually wants to be in a relationship with somebody for an extended period of time. Eventually, it's going to end due to deceit, abuse, and whenever the idealized understanding and the shared fantasy is broken, they have no use of the other person because they don't believe in the shared fantasy anymore, and the narcissist will cut them off right then. And they have no empathy, so they don't care. They move on to the next person, somebody who will then be lured in by the love bombing and the idealized fantasy. They are emotional vampires. They get energy from sucking the vitality and the emotional energy out of you. And so what Christ calls us to as Christians is almost the exact opposite of a narcissist. Christ calls us to be servants. A narcissist does not serve other people. He can't. He or she cannot serve other people. They're only interested in their own desires.
O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Now, to get into today's topic, I want to begin by saying, what is narcissistic personality disorder? And first of all, this is a spectrum. So this is certainly a mental disorder. It's characterized by patterns of exaggerated self-importance, the need for admiration for other people, diminished empathy towards others, and also it often is then take two. It often is accompanied by perpetual lying. And so we can see, again, when we get to the theological discussion, these are attributes that are totally antagonistic to a Christian worldview, where we're called to love, speak truthfully, care, we're communal. All these things are egregious to the narcissist because they need to validate this narcissistic understanding of themselves and this exaggerated self-importance. Oh, AC just gifted 3 COTEL crew memberships. Oh no, he is a member for 3 months. I'm sorry. And AC just said, when it's expedient in the stream, how to manage the internet pitfalls as a streamer. Yeah, well, we can get into that for sure at some point later. So thank you so much, AC, for all the support, brother. God bless you and the family. So in regards to what is narcissism, often a narcissist, they use and manipulate people for their own benefit. This is a strong tendency, again, in regards to narcissistic people, is that others are not anything other than a tool. A tool to be used for the elevation of oneself. Often this leads, and once we get into especially the romantic side of this, leads to abuse, because abusing others is a way in which narcissists can have control and they are empowered. And so they manipulate in a variety of different ways. We'll see when we get into romantic relationships, this begins often with love bombing, becoming the sort of idealized partner, getting somebody to fall in love with the shared fantasy. And often the narcissist exists in an exaggerated, idealistic understanding of themselves. And so what they're doing through the lies, through the manipulation, through the deceit, is trying to convince others to buy into their shared fantasy. And this is true whether it be a romantic or just a general narcissistic relationship, could be with a friend. But the whole point is that the narcissist is actually in a sort of fantasy idealized world, one about himself. And then when we look at romantic partners, they'll convince the other partner as well that they are an idealized form. And this is going to then account for the way they abuse the romantic partners, because they are sort of the corrective parent trying to elevate their romantic partner to that idealized form that they really know who they are, right? And so this is going to be even tying into social media. You'll see how I connect these here in a few. Narcissists often have a preoccupation, as I said, with ideal fantasies. Now, these fantasies often include themselves, obviously. So fantasies about their potential success, fantasies about having power over others, fantasies about how beautiful or attractive they are to other people. And certainly then when it comes to love, a sort of fantasy of an idealized loving relationship, which is often characterized by a sort of abuse of the other person and a manipulation of the other person to sort of signify their devotion to them by abusing them and allowing the person to put up with that abuse and still try to seek the attention and validation from the narcissist. They're often have an unreasonable sense of entitlement. And so often they are secretly envious of other people. They may not speak about this publicly or make any sort of public directions that they, in fact, are envious of other people. But often this is a sort of subtly laying under the surface. But they also believe that everybody is envious of them. So this is a narcissistic tendency. They often appear overly dramatic, emotional, and often erratic behaviors. So this is where narcissistic personality disorder is basically just adjacent to bipolar disorder, because the changing in moods, the changing in personality types can be quite dramatic or erratic. Again, when we get to the romantic dimensions of this, a narcissistic person that is a clinical narcissist, they one are the corrective parent trying to constantly criticize and in a way abuse the other person, but then that can flip on a dime, and all of a sudden they are a perpetuant child, a brat-like child that needs the attention and validation of the partner that they then were just abusing. And as Sam Vaknin talks about, it's a sort of inverted messiah complex, because they want the other person to be dependent on them, but then they'll switch to this childlike personality in hopes that the other person will be their sort of maternal savior, or if she's a woman and she's a narcissist, a sort of paternal savior. And so, and we'll discuss this here in a few. The DSM lists that there's 5 subtypes of narcissism. And so there is unprincipled narcissism, which is a sort of con artist, somebody who's a narcissist for they're typically a little bit less self-conscientious or conscious. They are not as self-aware, but it's all about the manipulation, getting people. This is the con artist, doing whatever they can to get your money, to sell you something. The second type is an amorous narcissist. This is somebody who is usually sexually seductive. It's this sort of narcissism is characterized by hedonism. Usually it's a sexual sort of hedonism. So they have many sexual partners. When we look at female narcissists, this is often a way in which they are narcissistic, because the women can get power over men through their sexual availability, or even their sexual, as we'll see, narcissists often have like sexual kinks, or sort of unique or perverted forms of sexuality. And for the women, they can lure people in this way. But the amorous narcissist, they tend to not be able to hold long-term relationships. But as we'll see with Sam Vaknin, he actually pushes against some of the general descriptions of narcissism or narcissists regarding the romantic relationships by highlighting that often narcissists will actually find a romantic partner that will at least commit to them for an extended period of time, because it allows for the development of the grandiosity, the shared fantasy, and then building on the narcissistic supply by getting the sex, the attention, the admiration, and then the abuse. So they need somebody to abuse, and they can't have, if they're just having real brief sexual encounters, they're not having people to constantly abuse. Now, in the case of narcissistic women, we could see how they would have multiple sexual partners, all leading them into a sort of shared fantasy that they're going to have a long-term relationship, or she's wife material. But at the same time, she's lying to you. There's deceit, and she may have multiple relationships at play. So this is one of the ways in that female narcissists will use sex and sexual seductiveness as a way to have power over other people. Then there's compensatory narcissists, and these people are more focused on the canceling of their interior feelings of inferiority. So again, we'll see with all of them, these are inflated understandings of oneself, delusions of grandeur, all types of stuff. But the compensatory narcissist is really focused on alleviating their feelings of inferiority. The fourth type are the elitist narcissists. And these are the types that you would imagine are running. They're CEOs of corporations. They wield immense power in society. And this sort of narcissist views themselves as incredibly special, separated from the rest of usually humanity. They're part of an elite group. They'll only associate with certain types of people. They may only wear certain types of clothing, this type of thing. They want to then display signals of their elite status. And this then can feed into the desire for other people to admire them. Again, the delusions of grandeur and all type of stuff. So the elitist narcissist typically is somewhat competent towards something. So we'll see that competency varies amongst the narcissists. Some people are narcissistic and they're actually not that competent, but they convince people of their sort of hierarchical social status. Other people can be very competent, but they lack total empathy. They'll get their goals at any means possible. And so the fifth category then is what's called normal narcissism. And this is considered the least severe. So the four that we just mentioned: unprincipled, amorous, compensatory, and elitist forms of narcissism are much more severe. Normal narcissism is least severe, and it's then characterized by, again, the stuff that we already highlighted: exaggerated self-importance, diminished empathy, perpetual lying, all this different stuff. So we wanted to begin with that. Now, we're going to be discussing, due to Jeffrey's request, a gentleman who I actually had never watched before. He has a pretty significant YouTube following. It's over 300,000 subs, and his name is Professor Sam Vaknin. He's an Israeli gentleman. He was arrested for financial crimes, and he later was diagnosed clinically with narcissistic personality disorder. And now he later then became a professor, and now he has basically an entire YouTube channel talking about narcissistic personality disorder. And we're going to be watching one of the clips, probably the first 10 to 15 minutes, in which he describes what it's like to be a narcissist. And then we're going to watch another clip that's going to be more about 20 to 30 minutes of him talking about the sort of cycles of narcissistic relationships. So we're going to be watching some of his stuff there. And so Sam Vaknin's work, just looking into his theories, is really what he does have some novel theories in regards to various psychologists dealing with the topic of narcissism. And what his angle is really taking a Freudian approach. And so when we listen to Sam Vaknin, it has a lot to do with sort of various outgrowths of the Oedipal complex in regards to childhood trauma, and looking for a sort of, again, he uses much Freudian language in regards to like incestual fantasies. And this is how then these things are projected onto the romantic partners. Oh, we got a shout out to Amptown One. God bless you, sister. Just saw you today at church. She says, I know a couple people who seem to think everyone is a narcissist except for them. And that is typical of narcissistic behavior. And when we get to the social media section, Amptown, we're going to see that this is common. We see narcissists cannot take accountability of anything going wrong or negative typically. And this is where it's going to contrast with a Christian understanding of repentance, sin, this type of thing. I mean, Christianity is really what Christ calls us to, is totally an opposition of what everything the narcissist is. But yeah, I was thinking about that too, Amptown, with all the women who talk about, oh, my last boyfriend was a narcissist. And then you talk to them, and then every boyfriend they've had was a narcissist. You're like, I'm starting to think maybe you're the narcissist. And again, we're seeing a little bit of self-projection there. But again, we're going to be talking about some of the detailed signs to look out for if you're getting into a romantic relationship, to make sure that you're not falling in love with a narcissist, because they are a sort of a vampire. They're an emotional vampire, and they literally suck the vitality out of you, and they get energy off, especially if they're psychopathic, off your own pain. And so they enjoy causing you pain because it actually gives them energy. So anyways, thank you so much, Amptown. I really appreciate you, sister. God bless. And so Sam Vaknin, he really builds upon Freud's understanding of narcissism. We're going to be looking at, I have the actual, Freud wrote about narcissism, and I have a link for you guys so you can read Freud's words for free if that's something you're interested in. You don't have to go buy a book. But we'll read just a few paragraphs of an overview of what Freud thought about narcissism and how it relates to, again, sort of the Oedipal complex and incestual understandings or sexual dynamics and stuff like that. So Sam Vaknin argues that narcissism is the loss of the true self and that it's replaced by delusions of grandeur. And they live based on the false self. So he argues that one of the core elements of narcissism is that a narcissist cannot look at themselves for who they truly are. And so what they do is they create a false image. And again, you can already see how social media is going to be impactful and why we're seeing clinical narcissism on the rise, or really all around the world. But obviously, we'll focus on the Western world because the studies we look at, there's one study that I'm going to highlight, really interesting, is they did a study of West and East Germany. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Berlin Wall, East Germany had communism. West Germany had all the accoutrements of Western culture, specifically individualism. And so this article or this study, what they showed, this is an academic study too, they found that narcissism and addiction to social media was much higher in Western Germany than that of Eastern Germany, where, again, because of the remnants of at least communist structures in their culture, that they're more communally oriented. And so our Western individualism is actually something that makes Westerners much more susceptible to narcissism. And we can understand why that would be the case. So Vaknin argues that they view narcissists, romantic partners, as idealized maternal or paternal figures. You can see the Freudian framework right there. And so he argues that it's a sort of sadistic, tough love to compensate for childhood trauma. And he argues, and this is, again, I was just reading some of the literature. There is a general consensus that often narcissistic people did have some type of childhood trauma, but that's not always the case. Not always the case. In fact, narcissism could be fueled as a child by somebody always getting what they wanted. And so, or there can be sorts of childhood trauma in which the narcissist is trying to sort of correct this trauma in a fantasy type of way in which they're constantly projecting these idealized structures onto other people or the world. And so Vaknin argues that what they tend to do, especially after the love bombing, so we'll discuss this in regards to the narcissistic love patterns. The first one is love bombing. But what they do is basically become the ideal partner and give all the affection and stuff to get the other person to fall in love with the shared fantasy of this idealized future. And once they've bought into, the other person has bought into this shared fantasy, they become a sort of sadistic, tough love parent in which they're constantly critical, criticizing, even abusing the other person, and the other person is yearning to get their affection back the way that it was originally. And so they then move from this corrective parental framework to like a spoiled brat. It's almost like a child. This is why narcissistic personality disorder is really just adjacent to bipolar disorder, because they can just flip on an instance and they go from this, again, this critical, corrective, paternal or maternal figure to all of a sudden they're childlike, and you need to satisfy their needs and satiate their needs and their desires. And he argues that what this leads into is a sort of inverted messiah complex, that they become like children with the hope that the partner, who's not narcissistic, will be their saving mom or their saving father. Okay. And so an important, again, understanding of Sam Vaknin's approach is that of the shared fantasy, as I've already said. So the narcissist, often through the manipulation of their lies, through, again, poetic rhetoric or whatever they want to do, they will lure the other person in who is not narcissistic, because it'd be quite difficult for two narcissists to actually abuse each other to the same degree. However, he does make the point, Sam Vaknin, that there is a sort of narcissism by proxy, that what they do is this shared fantasy. What the narcissist does is they idealize the other person and they describe the person as perfect. You're so beautiful. You're everything I've wanted. Nobody's better than you. You're the best. You're the best. And they get the other person to fall in love with the ideal image that they then have constructed of the other person in their own mind. And then they buy into this shared fantasy, one, the non-narcissistic person, of the idealized version the narcissistic person has of them, but then the idealized future. how great the romance is going to be, how the, maybe it's a promise of family or career or the house they're going to get together, whatever it may be. Again, with never the intentions of actually providing these things, but it's all sort of a total manipulation to get people to buy into the shared fantasy. And we talked a bit, again, when we were talking previously on insane asylums, I talked about psychopathy, and this has to do with the inability to actually perceive reality, but rather live in a fantasy. And we're seeing the exact same thing with the narcissists. The narcissists live inside a fantastic, idealized world that is constructed by them. That's one reason why they're in power of it. And then the goal is to get other people to believe into their idealized fantasy. This is how they lure people into the narcissistic delusion. So they are emotional vampires. They get energy from sucking the vitality and the emotional energy out of you. This is why, again, being in a relationship, a romantic relationship with an actual narcissist is incredibly detrimental to your own mental health. And this leads into, as he said, the sort of narcissism by proxy, because the narcissist creates such an idealized image of the other partner who's non-narcissistic that the non-narcissistic person falls in love with the image who the narcissist thinks that they should be. And this is one of the ways they keep them intact, is to get them to fall in love with their idealized version, and that gives them power, because if the non-narcissistic person wants to maintain the sort of false image of who they are, well, they have to be with the narcissist, because it's the narcissist who has constructed the idealized version of the other person. You see how that works? So when we get to social media, I think there's a relationship there. And there was a misnomer, because Sam Vaknin actually pushes against some of the literature in regards to narcissists and romantic relationships, because if you look at some of the general research, and if you go on like Psychology Today and stuff like that, they'll say that narcissists don't form long-term relationships. This is where one of the things that I noticed that Sam Vaknin actually pushes against, because he argues that no, the narcissist actually wants to be in a relationship with somebody for an extended period of time. Eventually, it's going to end due to deceit, abuse, and whenever the idealized understanding and the shared fantasy is broken, they have no use of the other person because they don't believe in the shared fantasy anymore, and the narcissist will cut them off right then. And they have no empathy, so they don't care. They move on to the next person, somebody who will then be lured in by the love bombing and the idealized fantasy. So he argues, contrary to most people, that narcissists actually prefer non-promiscuous women. If you look at some of the literature, they'll say, well, a narcissist, they want a promiscuous woman that they can have, brief sexual encounters with. Sam Vaknin says, well, that's true for psychopaths. So narcissistic psychopathy, when you're a psychopath, yes, you actually do want these brief relationships of sexual pleasure, but the majority of narcissists actually need a person to be there for an extended period of time so that they can get their narcissistic supply of admiration, the development of their grandiosity, and then the minimalizing of the other person and abusing them over and over and over. So you can't do that. If you only have a one-night stand, you can't do that. And so I actually think he makes a pretty strong argument there that narcissists actually the majority don't prefer brief relationships, but they need somebody to be there for an extended period of time. And so therefore they prefer non-promiscuous women, and they prefer women that are less likely to cheat, because cheating would be a sort of ultimate affront to the narcissist. Again, depending on the type. Now, there's narcissists who will get a woman like this, abuse them, break them down psychologically, and then potentially pimp them out. That is a potentiality, but that's a lesser case in regards to the way most people are going to interact with a narcissist in a relationship. The narcissist actually needs you. They need your energy. And so they can't just discard you right away. They need you there so that they can abuse you and take that energy from you to build themselves back up, right? So he argues then that there's the three S's. The three S's is that a narcissist, and this is where once they have lured the person in, they get sex, they get the supply. This is the narcissistic supply, the supply of admiration, the supply of the inflated ego, the supply of them being in a sort of dominant position. and then the services, especially for a man in regards to a woman. So doing things for them or whatnot. So they create a shared fantasy to extract these three S's from their potential partner. For a woman, it definitely would be sex. And then it would also be their narcissistic supply. And then the services could be the man's wealth, the man's money, the man access to the man's social status, access to the man's social circle. These are ways in which a narcissistic woman can manipulate a man for the same purposes. So the framework, according to Vaknin, is true whether male or female. So there's that. Now, in regards to narcissistic love patterns, these are things that you should be watching out for, as if you're a single person, male or female, and you're looking for a long-term romantic partner. These are the things you got to watch out for. The number one, as I said, is the love bombing. The love bombing. And so a narcissist will often be overly affectionate, paying you overly amount of attention. They're overly caring. They're going to do everything to be the ideal partner right from the beginning. And this sort of emotional high is how they can lure somebody in. So the overly affectionate, lots of attention, caring about your needs. This gives a false understanding to the non-narcissist. Oh, wow, this person really cares about me. And they'll convince the person that this is the perfect relationship. This is the exact thing that we've both been looking for. And then they'll talk about how the other person is so ideal. So during the love bombing period, this is where the narcissist will convince the non-narcissistic person of how perfect they are, how ideal they are, how beautiful. You're the most beautiful girl in the world. I've never seen a girl so beautiful as you. All with the hopes of getting that other person to buy in and believe the ideal fantasy. You see, this is the shared fantasy. So during the love bombing is where the promises are made, getting the other person on an emotional high, lifting them up, elevating the other person so that they're like, oh my gosh, I get these wonderful feelings and emotions from, Jimmy. Jimmy's the narcissist, we'll say, and Sally is the person he's talking to. Sally gets an emotional high by being around Jimmy because he's so affectionate. He's so caring. He pays so much attention. He makes me feel like I'm the most special girl in the world. I got to be around Jimmy because of the feelings that I feel. And this is something to watch out for. Again, normal relationships, it's fine to maybe hit it off quickly or something like that. But this is where both partners, if you're male or female, be careful with the love bombing. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. Now, that's not to say that there isn't God's providence and that he could bring you the perfect person. That's also true. But the love bombing stage is when they're convincing you of a fantasy. And if you buy into the fantasy, you, by proxy, are going to be brought into this delusion. And it's going to take a while for you to get out of it. And this is where the next stage after love bombing comes the decline. And the decline is where all of a sudden, he's not so affectionate anymore. He becomes a little bit more critical. Jimmy becomes a little bit more critical of Sally. Sally, you're not living up to that idealized version I told you about. I told you you're the most beautiful girl in the world, but you're gaining weight. You got to lose the weight. You got to do something, right? They become more critical. They become like the corrective parent. Like, look, Sally, I love you more than anything, but you're not who you could be. And to become who you could be, you need to do X, Y, and Z. First person Q throws in $2 and says, get rated. Oh, shout out. Is the Crucible crew here? Shout out to the Crucible crew. God bless you guys. Thanks so much for coming in. Crucible coming in hot. Shout out to Raymond Cannon. Yeah, I saw Andrew was doing his thing earlier over on TikTok. God bless the Wilsons. Appreciate you, Andrew. Thank you so much for the raid. But yeah, so the love bombing, when you're looking at romantic partners and you start to, some of the signs to watch out for is first, the love bombing. Everything is perfect. There's an emotional high and they're telling you how perfect you are. And then all of a sudden it's like a flip switches and now they're much more critical. They're much more negative about you, that pulls away previous affection, so that you then, as the non-narcissistic person, you want to move closer to the narcissist because you want to get those emotional highs back. And this, then the partner longs for the previous feelings and they become willing to deal with the abuse that comes from the narcissistic person. So this then makes the non-narcissistic person insecure because, Jimmy, for the first few weeks, he was perfect. He was everything I want. And now for the last couple weeks, he's been a little bit distant. He tells me everything's fine, but he's been a little bit more critical. He's been saying X, Y, Z, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I am fat. Maybe I did something. What did I do wrong? And then Sally comes back to Jimmy, what am I doing wrong? And they start feeling insecure about themselves because, again, they're buying into the shared fantasy of the narcissistic delusion. Then after this becomes a habitual pattern and the person is willing to deal with the abuse because they're thinking, I can fix this. There's something wrong. It's probably me that caused Jimmy to act this way. Then it's called the hang on period. This is where the partner, the non-narcissistic partner, cannot let go of the narcissist because the narcissist has brought that person into a shared fantasy in which they want to get back to that love bombing stage where everything was perfect, and they're willing to do anything. And they feel like they can't leave the narcissist because if they leave them, they're going to lose the hope of the emotional and the romantic ideal. And so the non-narcissistic person will do everything to get the narcissist to want them again. They become, this is where the service is, right? So the woman or the man, they'll do everything they can to get the affection back of the narcissistic person. And they then, like I said, will accept the blame for the relationship. This is what the narcissist does, is it convinces the other person that they're actually at fault. You're to blame. You're the reason why I keep criticizing you. You're the reason why you're not living up to the ideal. You're the reason why we can't have this shared romantic fantasy. You're the problem. And this is, again, the emotional abuse in which the narcissist gets power from because it builds them onto this pedestal where they get their admiration from the other partner. They get their aspects of grandeur, their delusions of grandeur, and they get to abuse the other person, and the other person won't leave them despite the abuse. And then eventually this always ends in discard. Now, Sam Vaknin highlighted that for some narcissists, if the non-narcissistic person cheats, this could be the point in which the discard happens. But the discard is when, usually, to some degree, and again, it's when the non-narcissistic person no longer believes in the shared fantasy. So the shared fantasy of the future, the shared idealized world that the narcissist has constructed, once that other person has been brought in, and once they have stepped out of it, they really can't be brought back in again because they see the game. They see what's going on. They no longer believe in the shared future fantasy that the narcissist has painted. And so the narcissist will then just end it. And he or she has no interest. And I'm sure men who have dealt with narcissistic women have seen this, that once you no longer are of use, or once you no longer believe the hope that they have painted for you, it ends immediately because they have no use for you because they can't extract the emotional capital which fuels and charges them. And so the discard is that the narcissist no longer needs the partner at all for their emotional fulfillment. And most likely at this point in the relationship, the narcissist has already developed or has been working on somebody else. So it could be love bombing, again, luring another person into the shared fantasy. And if you've already stepped out of the shared fantasy, well, they're luring another person into the shared fantasy, and they have no interest, no empathy. They don't care about your emotions. They don't care about any promises because it's all about emotional manipulation. Now, when we start looking at narcissism from a theological lens, I think this is really interesting because, as I said, the narcissist is actually satanic. And I don't mean that if you know somebody who's a narcissist that they worship Satan. Some people are narcissists and they don't even know about it. Some people are sort of aware of their continual manipulation of other people. But if we look at the characteristics associated with the narcissistic personality disorder, you can't help but then notice how they're all related to dimensions of Satan himself. Like, again, exaggerated self-importance, the desire to be admired. Lucifer was the most beautiful of God's angels, and he took a third of the angelic hierarchy with him. Those are who became demons because they gave him that admiration. They gave him that level of grandeur. Now, he wants to be worshipped as a god, Lucifer, right? This is how he falls into Satan. And Christ calls us to the exact opposite, right? A narcissist is a perpetual liar. And scripture is quite clear that Satan is the father of lies. And so, what Christ calls us to as Christians is almost the exact opposite of a narcissist. Christ calls us to be servants. First of all, a narcissist does not serve other people. He can't. He or she cannot serve other people. They're only interested in their own desires. Christ says, the lowly shall be elevated, the last will be first, the humble are the strongest, right? We need to humble ourselves. It's through humility we become closer to God. Well, the narcissist cannot humble themselves. They have an inability for humility. That is seen as a sort of a threat to their idealized understanding of themselves. And therefore, because they can't serve, they can't really belong to a community. And this is why narcissists, especially when they get in relationships, will often isolate the person from their family, because they don't want other people to be able to pull that person out of the shared fantasy. Again, the web of lies, the idealized false future. Well, that is manipulative. That is evil. That is something in which Christ tells us to do the exact opposite. We're not to live in a fantasy world as Christians. We're to live in the real world. And therefore we serve. When you see the homeless person on the street, you help. You help people in need. Christ calls us to be empathetic. The narcissist has an inability to be empathetic towards people. So Christ calls us to love others. This is where a narcissist actually can never truly love you. They can only love the idealized version they've constructed of you, and they try to get you to fall in love with that idealized version, where Christ tells us to love people as they are, right? We aren't perfect. That is quite clear within our Christian frontum, our Christian framework. As Orthodox, we are sinners, and we still love the other person. This is a mature romantic relationship, is that they're not perfect. They're not, again, everything that you could idealize, but you love them anyways. That's what true love is, the way in which God loves us despite our continual transgression against him.